Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I am a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. Now, on this podcast, my goal is to help you become a little bit more barbaric with your fantasy writing. I love fantasy novels. I read them all the time. I read a lot of new fantasy novels that sometimes don't grab me, and so I'm always excited to see who's going to be coming out with the next big thing. And everybody has, I think, a very unique story to tell, a very unique perspective. This podcast is just one of a few, many, I forget how many there are out there. But let's say this podcast is one of many resources that aspiring fantasy authors or maybe amateur on the rise fantasy authors can hopefully look to as something to maybe inspire you, get you into the mood to write, maybe help you rethink something you already knew a little bit about, that sort of thing. So that's why it's fantasy writing for barbarians, not just beginners. All right, so we have a prompt, of course, today. I haven't read it. This is going to be, as usual, an unscripted live reaction kind of thing. So I'm not sure what our producer, Natalia Emmons, has sent me today, but I do want to start with a frequently asked question, which I think should be kind of fun to do from time to time. And in fact, it has to do with one of our producers, Natalia. So I've been seeing this question come up a couple times where some folks are like, oh, it's cool that producer Bridget has those notes that I read out at the end of the show after Bridget listens to the audio. But a couple people were wondering, well, what does Natalia think of these episodes? Because we don't ever hear from her. And so Natalia's role on this podcast basically is that she finds the prompts for me. She's basically scouring Reddit and other communities for inspiration, ideas, prompts, and things like that. She's been looking at some stuff outside of the Fantasy Writers subreddit as well. And she's a little bit more anonymous. She, in fact, is going by an alias. And she said it's okay for me to reveal that. But Natalia's a bit private. She doesn't use social media or anything. And she just very much likes to be kind of, in the background a little bit more. And that's kind of her speed. So definitely want to respect that. But I mean, of course, she's been thrilled with how the podcast has been going. I think she has been enjoying the format, and she's very much a big part of helping really, produce the show and make sure that we're coming up with unique and, different kind of angles and different things that we can do with the podcast, different guests that we can have on. And in fact, can tease a little bit. We have another guest who's going to be on the show, hopefully in the next week or two, that I'm very, very excited about. I couldn't be more thrilled about. So that's Natalia, and thank you, of course, for being curious. Our producers make this show happen, and if you are new to the show, we do have another producer, Bridget Surdock, who helps me with fact checks and clarification. So since I am reading these prompts off the cuff and I don't have any prep time, I'm very, very vulnerable to making mistakes or talking about something in a way that isn't clear. And so Bridget really helps with coming in at the end of the show, providing some notes, and just giving me a chance to really explain or expand upon things a little bit more as needed. And that's been really helpful just because I think of stuff too, like after I do the recording and I put this away and Bridget gets a chance to listen, there are things I've been like, oh yeah, you know what? I should have mentioned this too. So it seems to be pretty helpful for that kind of accounting for the downsides of doing a live sort of format. So anyway, that's that. Let's move on to our prompt. I'm opening it now. This is in the Fantasy Writers subreddit, and it is from username Craven Lestrange. I like that one. That's a fun username. So Craven writes, struggling with the inciting incident and minor character motivation and avoiding too much exposition. We've talked a little bit about exposition on this podcast already, but we haven't talked a lot about inciting incidents or minor characters, so that's fun. Let's see what we can do here. Craven writes, I have a dilemma where I have most of the plot written out. I know what the themes are and what I want to happen. It all hinges on this one moment, and I have no idea how to make it work. Context. Main character and her twin brother live in an isolated village where the Fae kidnap children, firstborns specifically. For those of you who might not know Fae, usually like fairies and stuff, or like kind of dark fairies, think Maleficent in the live action Maleficent. So I'll reread that. Where the Fae kidnap children, firstborn specifically, annually, and make people forget. MC's family's ancestors were the ones who made the deal, so they're cursed with remembering. So she and her brother know something is off. So if you don't know, MC stands for main character. So saying the main character's ancestors made this deal, and they are apparently, so they remember what's going on as a curse. Okay. So she and her brother know something is off. Their mother is also a neglectful figure, which is important since it instills her primary negative traits. So she tries to manipulate the deal so main character is taken instead of her brother. The pivotal moment that sets everything off is where the Fae steals her brother away, anyway, and she offers to take his place. However, I'm stuck with the pieces that surround this. Does their mother insist MC's the older twin? Is the family immune, but she tries to strike a bargain in exchange for one of his children anyway? And why would she do this and not be cartoonishly evil, either to save the brother or the estate's fortune? Are both kids sick, so she tries to sell one for the health of the other? I'm starting to lean into the latter one, with MC being nearly blind and the brother having scoliosis, but that dips into messy territory of magically curing disability. So I'm not too sure about that. So, okay, when they're talking about the magically curing disability, this is a big taboo in publishing right now, specifically with fantasy. There are a lot of readers, there are a lot of agents who specifically will say, I'm looking for fantasy, but if your story incorporates this element of disabilities being cured by magic, I don't want to hear about it. And so that's kind of what they're referring to here. So I'm not too sure about that. I just know that I've been struggling with this for a month, and it's annoying because we never see their parents after they go off into the woods. So I don't want to shove a ton of exposition into the first 2 or 3 chapters for minor characters. But, do any of these ideas work? I've tried working on the world building to fill in gaps for the mother's motivation, but things still aren't quite meshing right. Okay, there is a lot in this. I see there's only one comment so far, I think. So this is where we have our work cut out for us, people. I might have to take this one step by step, but my overall impression of this, first of all, I think that this is a cool setup. I like dark fantasy sort of fairy tale retellings where this kind of feels like a mesh of a few things. The whole thing one of the things that stuck out to me was, the older brother going instead of the younger brother, I think is what they said. That I struggle with that a little bit just because it feels a little bit Hunger Games. It's very reminiscent of Hunger Games. So if you're going to do that, I think you do need some kind of, I don't know, twist on it or some kind of, if it turned out that what they're trying to say, and I hope this is what they're trying to say, the younger brother was supposed to be taken by this evil fae, and the main character tried to go in their place, but it didn't work, and the younger brother gets taken anyway. That would be more interesting. That would be a little bit more helpful because that would really set up who this character is, the main character. It would get us to like the main character. I wish they had put a name because it's kind of, but that's fine. It would help us like them more. It's save the cat. It's sort of like, wow, this person really cares about their sibling. The stakes are high. And that's good. And I think it avoids too, like this common thing that happens where we're not fridging the sibling. It's more of a rescue mission. That's cool. The thing that really sticks out to me too is the inciting incident versus the minor character and the motivation for what's going on here. So let's go through this again because I want to make sure I understand this, but we don't know too much about the context, which I guess is the point. So the main character and her twin brother live in an isolated village where the Fae kidnap children, firstborn specifically, annually and make people forget. First of all, with this sort of thing, I think it's very curious because it's an isolated village, which means everybody knows everyone, right? So it seems kind of weird that like people forget that this happens. Is the idea that people forget the firstborn child who was taken always like just like they forget they exist? Is that what it is? Is it kind of like the One Piece thing where there was this whole arc where people get turned into toys, but you not only do they get turned into toys, but you forget they ever existed. It's actually one of the darkest powers. So that has me kind of thinking, and this is important because the setup for this is going to really impact the mother character because depending on how dark and sinister it is, in a way, you do kind of have to make the mother cartoonishly evil for that to work. But let's go on from there. I guess we'll just assume what we know. So MC's family's ancestors were the ones who made the deal. So they're cursed with remembering. So she and her brother know something is off. This seems a little bit inconsistent because they know something is off, but they do remember. So how does that work? They know that children get kidnapped and no one believes them, but you're making it sound like they just think that there's a chill in the air. If something is off, that kind of implies to me that they know something is happening, but they don't know what it is specifically, and that's a bit confusing. I don't quite know what you're getting at there. I'm going to assume that you're just sort of downplaying how they feel about it, or they know something is happening, but no one believes that. That's more interesting to me, honestly, because then your main character and their twin, they get to be like conspiracy theorists a little bit. They get to be ahead of the game. They get to be a step ahead, and that makes them interesting. It makes them kind of compelling, makes them kind of likable, because you want to see them succeed because everybody else around them, it doesn't have the chance to succeed. So that's a good setup. So this thing too here about, so the ancestors made a deal, which is very curious. Why would they make this deal? I would say that whatever motivated them to make this deal should relate directly with the mother, right? Because in both cases, they're doing something for selfish reasons that doesn't quite make sense. It seems very counterintuitive. Why would you make a deal like this? What do you get out of it, right? And so in this case, my first thing when I first read this was, is the deal that like they're cursed with remembering, but their children never get taken. So if that was the case, then logically I would think the mother is sort of trying to do the same thing, because maybe the deal got broken for some reason, and that's your inciting incident. Your inciting incident is that the younger twin, for example, tried to tell everybody what's going on, and the Fae got very upset with that, and as punishment, reneged on the deal and took this child, even though they're not a firstborn. And the mother sort of went along with it in order to spare the other child instead of both of them being taken. That's a way to make the mother a little bit more, I'll say, complicated and nuanced, but also you're relating it back to these ancestors. I think it's kind of strange too, because you bring up that the parents don't come into the story again after this. And I don't think you can do that. I think that they don't have to be in the story physically, but I think the trauma of this situation, of the mother making a decision to basically like an impossible decision to save one child for the sake of the other, would be something that the main character has to carry with them and bring with them as how do I not be my parent in this situation? How do I solve this problem without putting someone I care about in harm's way? That's where that's how you connect your inciting incident with the motivations of the main character. A minor character's motivations are very important as they relate to what the main character has to do. So that's just one example of how this would work. And I'm being very prescriptive with this, mainly because it's kind of hard to talk around it. And honestly, this is just, there are so many ways to do this. And the only reason I'm being prescriptive, honestly, is because you say that you have your plot all figured out. I don't have the context for your plot. So it's extremely difficult for me to be, kind of helpful in a very specific way. But I'm trying to demonstrate how you can take the things that you already have in the story and just kind of give them a little bit more sauce. Put them in the same stew and really think about how they work individually. They should all connect in some way. It's good that you've kind of structured your plot a bit. Have the flexibility to tweak the plot as you go a little bit more if you feel like that makes sense for you. Let me keep going through this, make sure I didn't miss anything. So their mother is also a neglectful figure, which is important since it instills in her primary negative traits. So she tries to manipulate the deal so MC is taken instead of her brother. Okay, so I did kind of talk about the same thing. I just kind of forgot they brought this up. So that's, again, I think that the mother character here, if they're doing a bad thing for seemingly right reasons, that's something that you can instill in the story. You kind of bring up the disability thing. If she is thinking that this kid being kidnapped is for the best because maybe this character will probably do better out there as being kidnapped, or maybe the mother is like, I need this character here in this village because they're the only ones who can do this specific skill that benefits everyone, and their survival is too important. These are things that, again, it doesn't make the mother a good person, but it does make them understandable and believable. Just doing it for no reason, doing this terrible thing for no reason would not be interesting. It would turn readers off. It would just make them feel like, wow, this character sucks. I'm distracted by how awful they are. And you don't want that. You want the characters to feel the pain, you want the readers to feel the pain of the main character in this situation. So I would think of it that way and try to really just try to rethink what this mother character, like, why are they neglectful? That's a very important thing. Are they neglectful because they have 2 kids with disabilities and it has worn them down because they don't get any support from the village? The mother is, maybe it's a single mother, and she is burnt out from, having to do all of these things, all this self-sacrifice, and, the father of the children's not in the picture. The village ostracizes them. The village, in fact, kind of doesn't see them as beneficial to the health of the village. And she's extremely, because these kids are these like conspiracy theorists, the mother character just feels like, she doesn't have control over the situation and she's sort of checked out, burnt out. That makes her more interesting in that way. A bad character, a very flawed character, obviously, but also a character whom you want to see what happens next with them. That's the key thing. You want to see what happens next with this character. That's what gets people reading. What gets people reading for the main character is, I want to see them save their sibling. I know that they're capable of being good, and I know that they have a good head on their shoulders, but how are they going to solve these very difficult problems? That's what gets people to keep reading and want to see the story through to the end. So they go on and say, however, I'm stuck with the pieces that surround this. Does their mother insist main character is the older twin? I don't know if that's necessary. I think you could write around that in all kinds of different ways. Like I was saying before, it could be that changing the deal only has to do with the fact that these kids have done something wrong. I think that your inciting incident needs to give the main characters a little bit more agency. It feels like they're kind of just reacting to everything that's happening around them rather than giving them something. I think that they need to be more active in the story for the inciting incident to really land in this case. Because that's the thing, inciting incidents, there are 2 shades of them that I think work better. One is where the inciting incident is an opportunity coming to the main character or something that sets off an opportunity, because that is a little bit different. And in this case, that could be all kinds of different things. But also there are inciting incidents where a main character makes a change or something changes in their world and they change along with it to try to do something to react to the inciting incident. In this case, I think there's a little bit of that going on, but I kind of agree with Craven here that the pieces don't seem to be flowing. This should be very simple. And I'm going to give that same old advice I've given a bunch of times. Write this out as a query. How would you query this to an agent? How would you sum up the premise of this? That can help you really crystallize what works best as the inciting incident, because the inciting incident is going to be in that first paragraph if you're doing a query or a premise correctly. The inciting incident needs to be easily explainable. Something, here is the status quo, but then everything changed when this, and this happened. And what is that? If it's hard for you to explain, that's a good indication that you need to simplify it, rethink it, and try to kind of tweak the story a bit to fit into that simpler narrative framework. That's going to be a lot easier than trying to take what you already have and maybe give a false impression of what's going to happen, because you do not want that. You do not want to mischaracterize your inciting incident for the sake of an intriguing premise, because that's just going to lead to disappointment. It's false advertising in a way, not to be dramatic, but yeah, you don't want to anger or tick somebody off for that. And then Craven wrote, is the family immune, but she tries to strike a bargain in exchange for one of his children anyway, and why would she do this and not be cartoonishly evil? So I kind of already covered this, either to save the brother or the estate's fortune. I think that whatever you choose, it needs to be, again, it needs to be understandable and believable to go to such an extreme. For if it was to save the estate's fortune, first of all, it's an isolated village. I'm not sure how much wealth is really going to play into things, but even if it's something like that, well, what are the stakes? What happens if they go broke? Does it just impact her? If so, that's dramatically wild that you would, sacrifice a child, right, for that kind of thing, for wealth. That's so cartoonishly evil. But if it was something of like, this wealth keeps this village going. Me sacrificing my child is for the greater good, because then a bunch of other people in this village get to survive. Or it's that, they get to change the deal, so they take this one child and then the Fae will never come back and not steal any more firstborns. That would be such a more compelling inciting incident, and that would be such a more compelling minor character choice. It's believable, it's understandable, but it's also very flawed and very awful. First of all, they're trusting that this deal would go through, right? And of course, this would create such a rift, and such a complicated rift. It seems like you're writing a grimdark sort of fantasy, which totally, this fits right in line with that sort of thing. So that would definitely make it more interesting. And then Craven wrote, are both kids sick? So she tries to sell one for the health of the other. I don't like that. No, I would not do that. That, I think, like, they mentioned the whole magically curing disability, and I would not go there. I think that you are stepping into something that is very, very touchy, and it's very high risk and low reward. Quite honestly, you don't need to go into that territory. I think that, look, I'm a disabled person, and the whole thing, like, if there was a whole story around this where, like, somebody's hearing, like, I've seen stories like this come out where, like, hearing being sold by, like, dark evil, it puts a really bad taste in my mouth. It is very unpleasant. It's just not something you want to deal with. I just would not, because it starts to infer certain things about disability that A, aren't true, and B, alienate people with disabilities from others. And that's going to cause a very visceral reaction. I 100% do not recommend doing that. Please do not do that. So then, moving past that, Craven says, I just know that I've been struggling with this for a month, and it's annoying because we never see their parents after they go off into the woods, so I don't want to shove a ton of exposition in the first 2 or 3 chapters for minor characters, but Yeah, I mean, you've only been struggling with this for a month, which is a good thing. I think that that's okay. That's healthy, that you get stuck on something in a novel and you need time to work it out. My thing with working these things out, typically, I've brought this up before, it's a sign that maybe you need to step away from the computer screen or your phone or whatever you're writing this on, and just start to really daydream and put the scenes in your head for this, and allow these kind of to organically form in your mind if you can, or to take a pen and paper and to write out some kind of description of what's happening. Whatever gets your brain to move. For me, what gets my brain to move is being in the shower, driving, not having any screens in front of me, and having the time to just kind of think and kind of deliberate these things and daydream and let the scenes play out in my head. That's where I come up with most stuff, because if I'm staring at the screen, the pressure of having to perform through writing is way too much. I'm going to overthink everything. I'm going to struggle with my inciting incident because I'm going to be kind of what you're struggling with. I'm going to be overthinking every angle. It's not going to be flowing organically. I'm going to keep just sort of getting distracted too, and it's not very productive. There's always a time to just walk away from what you're working on, and just think on it more naturally. Go for a walk, whatever it takes. Go for a run, whatever helps you. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful, and hopefully, I haven't read this comment yet. There's just one comment. I'm going to refresh it. It looks like they literally posted this 30 minutes ago. An hour ago. I don't think Natalia has ever sent me a prompt so soon after it was posted, but apparently Natalia was a big fan of this one, so I appreciate that. So we do have one comment. This is from Bow Before the Cats. And Bow Before the Cats writes, what always works great as setup for alter. What? As set P for alter. Yeah, I don't know what they're trying to say here. I think this is a typo. So what always works great in such situations is the I know you can take it trope. Making sure the more self-reliant twin is taken because the mother thinks that child could cope with the new situation. So the kidnapped child thinks she got abandoned and rejected. Like, why did my mother think so much more highly of my brother than me? What did I do wrong? Just to realize near the end or middle of the story that it was not lack of love, but abundance of confidence in her that made her mother do this. And if you want to subvert the trope because you're tired of it, why would you? It's a great trope. You can just have the mother try and use this as a justification after the fact, and main character or her brother see right through the charade. The more interesting question for me is how they even change the deal with the Fae. Traditionally, Fae deals are interesting because they are unbreakable and honest. The Fae can't lie to you, and you can't lie to them. That's the base terms. Of course, you could deviate from that, but it's at least, in my opinion, the part that makes them cool. Hope any of this helped. Good luck with your story. Yeah, so my struggle with this is, first of all, I'm not quite as familiar with Fae in terms of like lore and mythology, so I can't really speak to that. I'm always for breaking the rules as you can, and kind of messing with things. I don't love sticking too much to establish lore and mythology because it's your story. You want to have your own twist. Maybe they can break a deal under the right circumstances. You don't know. You could totally mess with that if you wanted to. Or it could be that if the deal is broken by someone else, like I was saying, then the Fae then renegotiate, and that's how you can deal with this. I don't love kind of the suggestion here of, first of all, hanging it over the story of like the mother was good all along. I do not like that trope. I think that trope is very frustrating, honestly. It feels like lampshading, or it's just another way of saying like, this character did a bad thing, so we're just going to write out we're going to put a shade on the lamp to just kind of gloss over what they did wrong. Lamp shading usually is in reference to like, oh, there's a logical inconsistency here. We're going to lampshade it later by just like weakly explaining, something that try to retcon it basically. And that could be very unsatisfying. It puts the reader under false pretenses in terms of these characters. I like better the suggestion that like the main character and their brother know that the mother's trying to do this and this is a bad idea and they did not want this. That's going to be more interesting. That's going to be way more compelling because it's more true to life. I think people, like kids, know their parents, especially in this case. I think they would because they know something is off and all that stuff. I'm so curious too about the setup for this story of like how much these characters talk to each other about this curse and how much of it is just very, what about it sets them apart and makes them unique in the story. That's going to influence so much of how the mother behaves. And that seems to be what you're struggling with anyway. So yeah, I would definitely look at that. And yeah, hopefully that's helpful. And yeah, I don't see any other comments. So we don't have too much to talk about here, but that's all right. So thank you to Craven for your prompt. Hopefully I was able to help a little bit. And thank you, of course, Natalia, for sending that my way. With that, I am going to send this over to Bridget Surdock and see if Bridget has any notes for me or any fact checks or what have you that we can throw in there as well. So don't go away. I will be right back. And we're back. And wow, we have a lot to get through because in addition to Bridget's notes, and Bridget sent a lot of notes, which I'm very excited about. In addition to all of that, we also have more comments. And as you might recall, there was only one comment when I originally read this because the prompt was super fresh. So that said, very fun that we were able to do that. But at the same time, I would like to read some of these other comments that came through since I stepped away. So here we go. All right. So this comment is from Kitty Hamilton, a very interesting name. As someone who has spent too much time on Reddit, unfortunately, there are a lot of parents that end up with a scapegoat and a golden child. They lavish all their love and affection on one child and blame everything bad on the other. It could be as simple as that. Gender can also play into it, whether it is wanting a male to continue the family line or a level of emotional incest where the mother is unhealthily attached to her son. You could make something like this work, but again, I think the thing that I struggle with here is that, yeah, it is starting to get cartoonishly evil, which I think that's something that the original poster was trying to get away from. It did seem like Craven, it did seem like they were just struggling to make sense of this mother character being so unbelievably bad, and they wanted it to make sense. I honestly find it a little bit too cliche as well to be like, oh, the mother who, favorites one child over the other. We have seen that a lot. So you'd have to work really hard to make that feel fresh. So I don't love this advice myself, but totally, of course, up to Craven if they want to take that and see if that goes down a fruitful path. Agent Camp writes, why does the mother need to be involved at all? If you're never going to see her again after the first couple chapters, then do her motivations matter? Can the Fae just know the brother is the older twin if they know who the firstborns are? It doesn't seem much of a stretch that they would know the birth order. I like this idea, but I hesitate to endorse it. I like it in the sense that it would simplify things, which is nice, and it does take the mother character out, and it helps with the problem, but it does sort of take an element out of the story that I did pick up on, if you recall, just in terms of how it did feel like the mother's attitude toward the children was something that was reflected in how the kids see the world. So if you have absent parents, you do lose that, which could be detrimental to the emotional arc of these characters and make them feel a little bit too on their own. You want some character to tie back to the village and all that stuff. So yeah, I don't know if I would go with this route, but it is the right line of thinking. I think in a lot of cases, I would maybe do something like that because cutting characters can be so healthy for a novel. It's especially helpful in those early chapters where you don't want the reader to get overwhelmed by a bunch of new people. But at the same time, this isn't like the town mayor, right, who you can easily cut out. This is a mother. And I think there is something to that. I do think there is something to having a character tie us to the origins of them, their family. She seems like a pretty important character, even though Craven is calling them minor. My thing is that, okay, maybe they're minor in the plot, but I don't know if they should be considered minor in the abstract, in the emotional journey that the characters go on. All right, and this comment is from Proser Pina FC, Okay. And they write, I'm a big fan of making the absolute worst thing that you can imagine right now being the inciting incident and writing your beginning to lead up to that and your act two to resolve it as much as possible, giving you enough fertile ground to come up with an even worse, absolute worst thing that could happen as your climax. So for me, my story is already about a series of murder mysteries, so the absolute worst thing that I could imagine is a blizzard trapping several parties in town and several murders happening all at the same time in the confusion, which creates enough sensationalism to get my main character involved in all the stories. Okay, so I misread this at first. So I thought that they were saying like the worst thing in terms of like just a bad storytelling decision and not necessarily something that would make the characters suffer. So, okay, that makes way more sense. I'm glad I kept going with that because I was thrown. I was like, really? Oh, the worst thing? Oh. They did also write, once I work through all of that, I'll figure out what my next absolute worst thing will be. Yeah, so that actually brings up the flaw, the downside to doing what they're talking about. If you make your inciting incident super traumatic and you make it this big bombastic thing, then it gets really hard to top that as the story goes along. And without really knowing the plot of this story, it's hard to get a sense, right, of, okay, but how much, how much is the story really going to throw at us in this way? You have to be very balanced and you have to be very methodical in regards to the bad things that happen to the characters, because you are leading up to a very pivotal moment in every story, the all is lost moment. There's the point of no return. There's also the moment, like the major complications moment in a story. If you want more info on what I'm talking about, this is in reference to Michael Haig's 5-act story structure, which I adhere to a lot when I write a book. And these elements are just important, and just in the sense of helping the reader flow through the story and understand like the pacing of it, and for them to feel assured that the story is essentially going to fulfill its promises. So I would just be careful of that kind of thing. I think inciting incident, I don't love looking at it as what horrible things can I do to my main characters? I think that what happens then is like you do that horrible thing and then your reader has to basically go through the muddy middle, a bunch of chapters where nothing close to that sensational happens for a while. And then readers get bored. This has happened to me a lot in various books where I'm just like, okay, I'm glad that, the first few chapters or whatever gripped me, but I kind of need more here. I kind of need something else to kind of hook me in, because so far it's been very ho-hum since all of that. All right, so those were the new comments, some interesting ones. But yeah, I think that I think for the most part, I'm sticking to my advice here. Okay, so here's what Bridget wrote in their notes. Bridget writes, okay, so I'm assuming when OP says Fae, they mean the Celtic version of the Fae, but basically every culture has their own version of Fae creatures. I'm very glad, by the way, that Bridget is on the case with this because I know very little about Fae. I'm sorry, I DNF'd the Court of Roses or whatever, the Sarah J. Maas. I genuinely cannot get with her writing, so I just absolutely, when it comes to Fae, that's why I brought up Maleficent. What do you expect? So this is a mythological creature that I just don't have a ton of context for. So Bridget also writes, first things first, pick what kind of Fae you want your story to be about. Even if it is a completely original kind of Fae, decide that. Look into different cultures and how they use Fae. Or just go with the one you know the most, which is likely the Celtic version, as is for, I'd imagine, most of Western society. Additionally, Fae are rule followers. They seem chaotic to humans, but they're not. They're incredibly lawful. They have strict rules around contracts and what is owed to each other. Yeah, so okay, that kind of reminds me of the alignment chart for Dungeons and Dragons. It sounds to me like Fae are considered maybe lawful evil. Is that what we're maybe referring to? I don't know, maybe lawful neutral. You tell me. I don't think lawful neutral is a thing, actually. So yeah, forget I said that. Okay, also, Bridget wrote, maybe figure out the wording of the contract that the main character's ancestors made, and that could unlock some answer as to why it has to be the older twin who gets nabbed. So yeah, and I think the Craven even mentioned this of like a stipulation, like, technically a twin was older, maybe they weren't, something like that. You could do all kinds of things with that. And also, yeah, that makes sense to me. Why do all Fae have to be perfect rule breakers? What if they are, but at the same time, there's one who's just a little bit more devious and will be a Loki? They'll find a loophole in the contract or something like that. That's kind of interesting, and that'd be a nice twist on Fae without totally breaking the rules so that it's like, well, how is it's not even still a Fae? Why use that creature at all? So yeah, I think that would make sense. Bridget also criticized me mentioning One Piece. Not criticized, but just made a drinking game out of it, because since I mentioned One Piece, that means we drink. So One Piece mentioned drink is what they specifically wrote. And hey, I'll take it. I just don't want to get drunk, and that's possible when it comes to One Piece. Okay. Bridget writes, I'm trying to see if Fae have been known to alter memories in Celtic folklore, because that is the version I'm most familiar with, and it doesn't seem like they did outright. It was mostly illusions and deception stuff, which could be memory alteration. I'd probably have to find a specific story that includes it. Most research into Fae abilities brings up Dungeons and Dragons stuff, or at least in my search engine it does. But yeah, just as a reminder, Bridget is of course a legendary dungeon master, so it would make sense that their Google search results are geared a specific way. They write, there is, of course, the classic Fae deal of trading a memory for something you want. So that is a thing, actually, now that I think of it. Yeah, and that can, hopefully, that makes me think of a few things in terms of, like, trading memories. It would make more sense if this whole village had been in on this deal at one point. It's just there's one group that isn't for some reason. I don't know. Again, there's all kinds of things you can do to make sense out of this. I don't think that that's necessarily the issue for Craven. It's more so they're like, how do I actually connect this stuff in a way that makes sense? So yeah. Bridget writes, it's hard to believe that OP has their entire plot figured out if they don't know their inciting incident. Yes, 100%. Bridget, I couldn't agree more. And that was throwing me off too, because I was like, I do understand to some extent. Like, I've gone back and I've revised things, and I have found that maybe my inciting incident needed to be tweaked. But to not really, I'll put it this way, actually, because it does seem like they have the inciting incident. The inciting incident in this case is something along the lines of one of the twins being nabbed. I think what they're struggling with more here is the mechanics of the inciting incident, how to actually make it work, how to make the inciting incident feel real and believable and nuanced, and for it to just work logically. I think it's less that they haven't been able to figure out the inciting incident or what it is necessarily. It's more about choosing the right kind of inciting incident. And the way to choose your inciting incident in this case is, I think, you take a look at the plot in the macro, and you take a look at how the story develops. And again, you want the inciting incident to be a precursor to a new opportunity for the character. So the inciting incident in this case is that one of the kids gets nabbed, and one of them, the main character, goes on a quest to find them. You then need a new opportunity, something that is going to help that character glimpse who they really are. So the main character maybe has a false sense of their identity. This inciting incident changes their status quo, and then the new opportunity needs to come in the sense of when they go on this journey, what's actually going to follow from this inciting incident that changes them in the way that a story should. And that's the thing we don't know, because we don't know the plot in detail, right? So that would require, I think, Craven taking a look at this again and trying to make sure that the journey that this character goes on is complicated, because it should be complicated by different things. We should have, for example, a new opportunity would be a character comes into their life and teaches them what it means to find belonging. That's the kind of thing that you want to infuse in your story to give it that energy, that life, that, storytelling flair that is what readers are going to engage with. I was thinking about this actually the other day. It's something that has been brought up quite a bit in writing classes. I was in a writing group once and we had a long discussion about this. One of the things I absolutely despise that I do, and that so many people do as authors, we forget what it's like to be a reader. We write so many things really with the audience of a writer in mind. And that is not the right way to look at this. Writers, we have our own brains. Even when I'm looking at this stuff, I have to caveat it and constantly reorient myself to be like, but how would I actually read this as a reader? Not as a writer, not as somebody who knows all the rules, but as somebody who is sitting back without those expectations of prose and all of these other, writing, rules and videos I've watched and podcasts I've listened to. The problem is that when you are a writer and you're trying to get feedback, typically the other people willing to give you feedback and constructive feedback are other writers. And that can sometimes get you to forget, right? How will people actually respond to your book? And in that sense, readers want familiarity. It sounds weird, I know, but they do. They want the tropes. They want the story to feel different, but to also feel familiar at the same time. I brought this up before, but the classic, this is something Will Ashton, my co-host for Cinemaholics, the movie review podcast I do, he's brought this up again and again whenever we try to predict which movies become breakout blockbuster hits, particularly in the summer. And Will always makes this point that I think is so apt, which is that the movies that tend to make the most money commercially are the ones that, they do have to be somewhat good. Okay, they're not all stinkers. But the thing that kind of unites a lot of these movies is that they are familiar. They have an essence of something that people are comfortable with and familiar with, but they are just different enough. They have something about them that also feels different. So look at a movie like Barbie. Barbie was a totally different movie from what we had seen in previous summers, but it also had something very familiar to it at the same time. People know what Barbie is, right? This is why a lot of Pixar movies tend to do so well. Inside Out 2 was the highest grossing movie of the past summer. One of the reasons it was because Inside Out 2 was very familiar. We know these characters, we know the Pixar style, and we kind of understand like the concept, but there was also something very different about it. New emotions were coming in. It was a different story about anxiety, and moviegoers flocked to this movie for that reason. And that is kind of what I'm getting at, that your story does need to have some things to it that ground the reader in something that they can just wrap their heads around, if that makes sense. I know it seems counterintuitive. We all want to be super original, and we should, but we also need to understand the marketplace. And there's a time to write your stories for yourself and in a way that for you is more idealistic, or that is more individualistic to, the kind of book that you just think is a stellar quality. Who cares if people like it? There's a time and place for that, and you can write that book right now if you want. Don't let me stop you. But if you are in this to publish a book, to traditionally publish a book, get something out there to the masses, this is one of the paths to that. It's one of the main paths, and honestly, one of the easier ones, quite honestly. I think the easiest path is to be famous. Famous people get book deals all the time. But barring that, because becoming famous is even harder than publishing a book, then yes, you need to also consider, writing your book in a way that is comfortable and familiar, but also fresh and original. Things that feel like total contradictions, but there is just a very, very narrow path where those things intersect. It's up to you to find that Venn diagram or whatever I'm describing here. Okay, so then Bridget also said, and I'll recontextualize. So Bridget had said, it's hard to believe that OP has their entire plot figured out if they don't know their inciting incident. They also wrote, especially if the mother is so interconnected with it. That is going to carry through the rest of the novel, no matter what it ends up being. Be it resentment toward the mother, anger at the Fae for not listening to their mom, confusion as to how she could have let this happen to them, whatever it may be, it's going to be there. That will be the emotional conflict of this story, or at least one of them. And if OP doesn't know how it happens, how can they have the rest figured out? Yeah, and one thing I would add, it does remind me in a way of Mistborn again, since we did bring that up already, I guess, in a previous thing. Just recall in Mistborn that there's a very major character who never even shows up in the story, and it's Vin's brother, who dies before the story begins, but he has this like constant influence on Vin throughout the novels, and it's part of the story. He doesn't have to be in the plot to still factor into the story, because the trauma that Vin is going through stems from her backstory with him. And you can do that with the mother character too. You can have the mother character not be part of the rest of the plot, but she shouldn't just disappear. She should still factor in. She should still be thought about a lot. She should still be a persistent thing in your main character's mind, because how could she not? Even if she had nothing to do with the inciting incident, kids are hung up on their parents. There should always be like a logical connection to whether they think about their parents or they don't, and why that is, and so that the reader can understand and relate to your character, at least in some way. Bridget wrote, I get objectively you can figure it out in pieces. You don't have to write it all in order. You can do the end first, or the middle, or jump around like it's a frickin' leapfrog. But after a certain point of leapfrogging, you need to know what that inciting incident is to be able to make the rest of it work together. Same goes for the ending. If you know the inciting incident and the middle, but don't have your ending figured out, the rest won't work. I get what you're saying, Bridget. I think you're right. I will say a lot of the time, half and half. I will have the inciting incident and I will have a lot of the middle stuff. Sometimes I completely change what the ending is, though. I think the ending is the squishiest, or it tends to be. And I know Brandon Sanderson, again, I'm bringing up Mistborn, I'm bringing up Brandon Sanderson, who am I? But Brandon Sanderson has said that his favorite way to conceive of a novel, I think he does this for most, if not all of his books, is he likes to think of the ending first. And I think that's cool. I've tried to do that before. I don't think it always works. Personally, I'm a bit more in the camp that Bridget is talking about, which is like, I want to start from the start. I want to like bring up the first part of everything. And I want to figure out the emotional ending, sure. But I don't always come up with the ending that early, quite honestly. In fact, I'd say that the last time I did that, probably, and that I should say this, I've never done that and stuck to it. There were a couple of book projects I did that never saw the light of day. I didn't think they were good enough. But I remember I started with the ending and I worked so hard to build a book around the ending and it just didn't work. And that could be a me thing, but there could be a lot of you who maybe have heard that same advice and be like, Brandon Sanderson did it this way. I'm sure that it works totally fine for a lot of people, but not everybody. And you should always have that in mind, that anything I'm saying to you is not going to be perfectly applicable to everybody. It is just one perspective out of many. And in that case, I have run into that issue where, yeah, I struggle to come up with the ending at the same time as this other stuff. That's a me thing though. And I have found that I love to be pleasantly surprised by where the ending goes. I usually come up with the ending, honestly, about halfway through drafting. I don't usually think of the ending until I get that far along. It's not great. I do structure it out and I have an idea. I have a concept of the ending for sure. I have concepts of a plan. But the problem that I run into is that I always move away from my original intention. And so I never get hung up on it. I don't think about it too much because I know I'm going to change it. And I want that freedom to change it because that just works better for me, quite honestly. And then Bridget wrote, in response to me talking about taking a step from the computer, step away from the computer, read something else, pick up a book, maybe one that has similar themes. Or let me reread this because I think I'm reading this poorly. Bridget said, taking a step away from the computer, read something else, pick up a book, maybe one that has similar themes or also deals with Fae deals, or one that is completely different and a total palate cleanser. For myself, when I get to a point where the words aren't coming correctly, the best way to reset my brain is to read something else, to look at other people's words and ideas. I find it much more effective than trying to think about the piece I'm writing differently or to just go touch grass or whatever. Yeah, I'd say that there's no one way. I think for me, sometimes I do think of stuff while I'm reading a book. I would actually, though, I'm kind of weird because usually when I read a book, that doesn't inspire me with ideas. I don't think about my book much when I'm reading a book. I think about my book only in the sense of like, I want to work on my story again because I'm having a good time reading this fantasy. It's fun. But the thing that usually inspires me in terms of like, okay, now it spurs my brain in terms of like, I'm feeling inspired or like I'm feeling ready to sit down and dream things up. That happens when I watch anime, quite honestly. It's very cliche, I guess. That's a very familiar thing, I'm sure, to plenty of people, using anime as the basis of your book. But no, I don't try to base my story around anime tropes, but very many times I'll be watching an anime and the way that the story, particularly in manga too, but typically the way manga and anime blend storytelling or like emotional storytelling with action scenes is something that I just think they're super, super good at in the East. And it's something that always gets my brain turning, particularly when I watch a very good like high school romance anime, quite honestly, weirdly enough. And that's the thing. Going outside your genre helps a lot with this stuff. I don't know if Bridget's implying that as well, but I like to read YA books sometimes when I'm feeling like my adult fantasy is kind of slugging, or if I feel like my prose, like reading books does impact your prose, by the way, a lot. And I will sometimes have to take a break from a book I'm liking because it's impacting the book I'm writing too much. These phrases will pop into my head where I'm like, that's a little bit too formal for the book that I'm working on right now. And that's happening because I'm reading George R. R. Martin right now. And so I kind of need to take a break from that so that I can finish this project I'm doing. And again, I don't know if that happens to other people as much. I assume it does because when you put the words in your head, I mean, they have to go somewhere else. I mean, they don't just stay in there forever. Bridget wrote, and again, yeah, sorry, this is a long This might turn out to be longer than the first part, but we have a lot here. Bridget said, if we're talking where to do your brainstorming, though, it's in the car, it's walking the dog, it's on a run. And yeah, I think all those things are valid. We're all going to have like a different time or space to think on these things. Maybe for some people, it's like sitting on the couch. For me, I have to be more active. I have to be like doing something. I know driving isn't necessarily active, but just in terms of like, I'm going somewhere, I'm doing something. If I'm just sitting there not doing anything, my brain doesn't want to be creative. My brain just kind of wants to sleep, quite honestly. Bridget wrote, Celtic Fae can't lie. That's their whole thing. They will tell the truth, but they'll talk around it. They'll also create illusions and stuff to mess with you. I can't confidently speak to other cultures, but I do think that is a general through line for most Fae mythologies. Also, deals aren't necessarily unbreakable, but if they are broken, something else is taken by the Fae. Oftentimes worse than what they originally asked for. Because by breaking a deal, you not only didn't pay them back for what they gave you or did for you, but you broke a law, which is even worse. Again, this is all Celtic Fae specifically. Other cultures might have different rules and stuff. But also, again, this is fiction, so like F the rules. You can change them to fit the narrative you're trying to tell, though if you change it too much, maybe don't call them Fae, call them something else. Yeah, I would maybe go with Robert Jordan's rule of thumb on this. He created the Trollocs, right, in Wheel of Time. The Trollocs were kind of just his version of orcs, and they were different enough from orcs in terms of where they came from and how they worked and what they looked like that it wouldn't have been as fun if he had just called them orcs. But he changed certain things about them. He gave them a cool name, and then they became their own thing. They're not goblins. They're not barbarians. Shout out to the title of this podcast. No, they were Trollocs. And I think that was the smart thing to do, quite honestly. And yeah, maybe you can do the same. Maybe you can, use Fae in terms of like the marketing and obvious inspiration. But yeah, maybe there is something to that. Maybe there's something to maybe messing around with the mythology enough so that it can feel like its own thing. I've gone through this as well. I've gone back and forth, for example, with having my own version of like a warlock, where I ultimately then, it was so different from like a typical warlock that I ended up just changing the name of it into something else. That was my own thing. And yeah, sometimes that works. Other times, not necessarily. You can just maybe do the Fae thing if you feel like that's what's best for your story. But yeah, something to think about. Bridget wrote, also, little fun fact about Celtic Fae, according to Irish and Scottish folklore. The Fae speak Gaelic, which is a very literal language. There is no or yes in the language. If someone asks, did you do this thing? The response is, I did not do this thing. It's very literal and very direct, very much like the Fae themselves, which makes it pretty difficult for the Fae to trick someone who speaks Gaelic. I hope that's got me kind of thinking, like that could be pretty helpful. And also all this Gaelic talk, it reminds me of, I think Fourth Wing uses a lot of Gaelic stuff. I know that's all like dragons and griffins and whatever, but yeah, speaking of books I did not finish. Okay, Bridget also wrote, Bridget was on a tear for this one. Love it. Someone who speaks English perhaps could easily be tripped up because of the way in which the Fae speak to them. They'll use the same grammar rules used in Gaelic, which feels weird in basically every other language. And the human will respond in a way that makes sense for them, but will inevitably screw them over with the Fae. The whole, would you be so kind as to give me your name? They're not asking what's your name. They're asking you to literally give them your name. Yeah, and this reminds me of like nursery rhyme stuff, fairy tales, like trickery, things like that, Hansel and Gretel. That very much seems to match the vibe of what Craven is working on here. So I think that's really well put. I actually think, Bridget, you're kind of nailing this. I think you're being extremely helpful. So I really, really hope Craven checks us out when we send them the link to the show, which, shout out, we've been doing that. We've been Natalia's been sending the episodes out. We've been getting some really positive responses from the folks who, so far, that we sent this out to. So shout out to that. Bridget also wrote, I don't know enough about Gaelic to know for sure if that's a direct translation of the question or not, but that's the general idea of the Gaelic languages being the language of the Fae folk. Also, I understand that Gaelic isn't really a language. There's Scottish Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, Welsh Gaelic, which are ultimately just Scottish, Irish, and Welsh. Other fun fact, Welsh is the only Celtic language not classified as endangered by UNESCO. Wow, I think, Bridget, you're the one who needs to be working on a Fae novel because you have quite a lot of research under your belt with this. I am very, very ignorant of a lot of this stuff, particularly Gaelic languages and all that. Not really my bag, not something I have a ton of experience in, but very happy that Bridget was able to fill in the blanks on some of this because I never would have caught it. Any of what they're talking about in terms of how this could be super helpful for Craven's story, or at least getting them thinking about some of these larger implications. Maybe some of this stuff they're already well aware of course, but just in case, I think that could be really, really insightful for them. So, okay, this was super long, obviously, a lot longer than I intended, but I think for the best because there was a lot to cover. And yeah, I think that there's more I do want to say about inciting incidents that I didn't quite get to. So I do want to table that maybe for a future episode to talk more about what makes an inciting incident good, for example, and things along those lines. So hopefully this was still helpful nevertheless. And yeah, that's it. I'm going to call it here. Thank you so much for listening, and be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.